Daddy, can you teach me how to make 3D?
In this video, I'm going to show you how I went from this 2D illustration to a 3D sculpted model. The original illustration is by Els Fee, a super dope artist from South Africa. This is actually our third piece that we did together. We did a couple more pieces since the top of the year as well. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I went from Nomad Sculpt to Blender, how it was textured in Substance Painter, and how I added some of my own techniques and style to the final render. Everything you need to know is in this video, so stay tuned. So like I said, this is our third piece that we've done together. It's been really fun and challenging to take a 2D piece and turn it into a 3D piece. So it's actually helped me to improve my sculpting skills. At the top of the years when I really started to take sculpting seriously, I bought a tablet and I got on Nomad Sculpt and started learning the program and learning some of the techniques to improve my skills. So this is actually starting off from the last piece that we did, and I'm basically just taking everything that I learned through trial and error over the last 6 months and applying it to this project. So when I originally sculpted this, I did it as best as I could with the skills that I had at the time, but the eyes were a little off, the nose wasn't the greatest. I always struggled with lips, so I've kind of been focusing on improving my sculpting around lips as well. So here I'm just going through, fixing all of that up, refining the edges, building out the volumes, and just making it more proportional and pleasing to the eye. Another thing that I really struggled with early on in sculpting was to get the model to look good in the matte cap. Like once you add textures and you add lighting and everything like that, it can hide a lot of the imperfections, but I've really been focusing on getting the actual sculpt the best that I could get before I take it into Blender and start adding materials. So once I get the foundation how I want it to be, I take it into Blender, so I just export as a GLB out of Nomad Sculpt. So here I'm just starting to block out the rest of the scene. So I added in the earrings and now I'm box modeling the outfit. So I'm starting with the shirt. I'm just getting the basic shape. I'm not worried about too many details right now, keeping it as simple as possible. Then here I am also doing the jacket. So here I'm just using the Bezier curve to make the strings onto the jacket. Then I'm adding a simple backdrop and some simple lighting with a HDRI. If you watch any of my previous videos, I talk about the Substance Painter plugin. So I like to use the Substance Painter plugin just to drag in some quick textures, and then I go back in and refine and add more detail in Substance Painter later. So here I imported the eyes from the previous project that we've done together. So I'm just experimenting with different lights and different ways to show the eyes to come up with something that looks cool and unique. So here I'm modeling the ears. So I started off with a cylinder. I'm just scaling it in on the y-axis a little bit and then just insetting it a couple times and adding a subdivision surface. If you look at the original image, the ears are pretty simple, so I wanted to play off of that and keep that same vibe. And then I just scaled it in a little bit to make it more of an oval shape. So next we get to texturing. I'm going to slow down the time lapse a little bit on this section because I want to make sure that you can catch all of the details and the little things that I'm doing throughout the process. So with a character like this, I like to start off with the plastic grip. I almost kind of like to think of it as like an art toy, and I scale that resolution down a lot to make it look like a fine plastic. So now I'm going through and I'm adding the colors of the face. So if you look on like Pinterest, you'll be able to find like color zones. So usually around the cheeks, maybe around the mouth a little bit, around the ears it's going to be more red, around like the eyes, or above the eyes and on the forehead it's going to be more yellow. So I'm just getting that basic foundation down. The last project that we did together, I found out about the paint along the path tool. So instead of trying to manually paint all these details by hand, I like to first start off by like doing like an outline of the part that I'm going to paint in, and then I just use a brush and paint in the rest. So we started off with the lips. I painted that in, and then I added another layer and kind of added some more of that pink tone and blended that into the original layer. Now I would suggest that you name your layers when you're working on this. I was a little bit lazy, even though I knew that there was going to be a bunch of layers to be added. So you're going to see later on I'm going back and hiding things to try to figure out which layer is what to make those changes. So I always suggest to just stay organized. So once I had the foundational colors of the face down, I started to add the details. details. So what I did was I just looked at the original image and kind of figured out what was sitting on top of what, right? So the first thing I wanted to do was work within these deeper reds and start building out all of these outlines. So again, I'm just using the paint along the path tool because you can adjust it later if you mess up or you need to move something. And then I'm also utilizing pressure on each of these points. So if you look on the top here, you're going to see pressure, it goes from 0 to 100. So this will actually taper any one of the points that you have selected. So here on the neck, I'm using that pressure. I do it again, select that endpoint, turn down the pressure, and then it matches what the original illustration looks like with the brush strokes. So once all of my deeper red outlines were complete, I started working on some of the other elements. So here now I'm working on this orange circle. And the reason why I also like the paint along the path option is because you can change the brush that you use later, and you can also change the flow of it or the size of it. So here you can see I'm just adjusting the size and the brush, and then I'm dragging this layer under the red layer because I wanted the red to sit on top of the orange. So after that, you can see we have these yellow circles that sit on both sides of the face. So I turned on the symmetry option, and I'm still using the paint along the path to build all of this out. The reason why I like this workflow is because you can move stuff around after the fact, and if you mess up drawing it by hand, you'd either have to like use a mask or redraw it. So it adds flexibility and in a non-destructive way to be able to build out your texturing over a model. So I'm just going through, checking the original model, checking what I'm working on in Substance Painter, and just adding it one by one. One thing I like to suggest is you don't have to do everything on one layer. It's breaking it down into the simplest forms and then just building that up on top of each other. That's the best way I found to work when doing something like this, especially with so many different elements on a model, right? So don't feel like you have to have it all on one layer, separate it out, break it down piece by piece, and it'll make it a lot easier for you. So the next part that I did were these lines that went across the cheek under the mouth. Again, I have the symmetry option on, and it looks like there's a gradient on there. So what I did was I did it in the first color, and then I duplicated that layer and changed it to the orange color. And then I just used a mask to take off some of the orange over the yellow and make it look more like a gradient. And then I also left some orange and some yellow on the opposite side just to make it look a little bit more random. So that's just a cool little way that I found to create that kind of gradient look on that section. So after that, I wanted to see what it would look like with some different lighting scenarios. So I'm just throwing some different HDRIs on there to seeing how the painting reacts to the light. I usually like to use some of the same HDRIs for most of my projects, but I also like to see how it looks in different scenarios. So once I liked the way it looked, I started adding some of that spray paint and grain layers on top of everything, right? So if you look on the original model, there's like a lot of this kind of spray paint texturing on top of it. So I wanted to mimic that. So I'm just taking some of that same deep red burgundy look and adding that in. So once that's all done, I like to export all of those textures out, put it into Blender, and then start to see how it reacts to the lighting in Blender and what my final render may look like. So here I'm just starting to build out the lighting. I wanted to keep a lot of the oranges in there, but I also wanted to counter that with some blues. So basically I'm just kind of going through and experimenting and building out how I want it to look. I was going to go with a white background or an orange background, but I decided to kind of keep the blue that I use in most of my pieces as the background and kind of build off of there. The next thing I did was pull in the lashes from the previous project that we've done together, brought those in and just kind of adjusted them to make them fit in with the current model. Now I'm just finalizing some more details. Next, I started building out the background. Very simple. I just added some spheres and then added an emission shader to those, placed some randomly around. I did some more of like the pinkish red and then some of orange. And then I did 2 Bezier curves to mimic what was in the original. And then I just duplicated those and dropped them in front of each other to kind of make it look like they blended in together. So after that, I moved on to the texturing of the jacket. So I pulled these clouds off of just a stock site, and then I adjusted them in Illustrator and then brought them into here as PNGs. The orange cloud was initially too light, so I darkened it up and then brought it in. And then I'm just using a mask and some paint along paths to add the lines over the cloud so that you can see the material underneath them. Once that was all done, I just went through and also added some of these spray paint textures over the top using some of the different colors. So then another thing that I like to do is never finish a project like in 1 or 2 sittings. I like to go and do some other things, let my mind work. So I was looking at it and I was like, oh, let me pull in some of this spline painting that I've been using recently on other projects and incorporate into this project. So here I'm taking a shirt and I'm just using spline painting to recreate all the geometry on top of it. So I'm just going through over the whole shirt that's going to be visible to the camera. I thought that the strokes were a little bit too wide, so I brought them down and added more geometry to fill in those holes and tighten it up a little bit. And I also like this method because it adds a lot of depth once you put the textures on top of it, as well as some interesting textures. So I've really been enjoying using this technique because it really adds a unique perspective and look to the final render. So once I'm done with the spline painting, I convert those splines into a mesh, then I export that out into Substance Painter. So here I'm adding a basic fabric texture, and then I'm using the PNG from the artist to put on top of the shirt, and then adding some spray paint textures on top of that. So once the shirt and the jacket were textured, I moved on to the hair. So here I'm just doing a mask and extracting that mask and simplifying the geometry with quad remesher. And then I'm just using the built-in geometry nodes for hair to build out that hair. So I only really use a couple, I was trying some set hair curves and then the frizz hair curves and just experimenting. I was gonna have the hair kind of look like a fro, but then I just decided to keep it short in the final render. So here I'm just doing some test renders to see how long it's gonna take to render and what it's gonna look like. After that, I noticed I was missing some details like the eyeshadow around the eyes. So I hopped back into Substance Painter, adjusted those, added that. I saw that they were too big. So I'm gonna go back into Substance Painter and fix that. And like I said, that's the benefit of using those paint along the curves, because you can go back in and adjust that, make that stroke wider or smaller or whatever you want. Then I noticed that the image on the shirt was sitting a little bit too low, so I went back in and adjusted that, made it a little bit smaller, brought it up, and then I'm just doing some final adjustments on the light, and that's it. So here's the final render. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was helpful. If so, let me know in the comments. If you like my videos, subscribe. Until next time, peace.